The year is approximately 2700 BCE on the alluvial plains between two rivers. A king stands at the precipice of a decision that will reshape the architecture of human ambition. His name is Enmebaragesi of Kish. This is intolerable to Enmebaragesi. Not merely as a matter of pride, though pride matters immensely in an age where kingship itself is a performance of divine mandate. It is intolerable as a matter of structural economics. Kish cannot maintain its position within the Sumerian interstate system without demonstrating the capacity to secure its own supply lines. The rival cities, Uruk to the south with its legendary walls and its ambitious kings, Ur with its maritime trade networks extending to the Persian Gulf, Lagash with its aggressive territorial expansion. These powers are watching. They are calculating, and they are waiting for Kish to reveal weakness. Elam does not need to conquer Sumer. It merely needs to throttle its eastern frontier. And in doing so, it forces Enmebaragesi into a strategic trap. Accept economic strangulation, or project military power across hostile geography into an operational environment that favors the defender at every level. The decision to wage war is therefore not a choice between conflict and peace. It is a choice between controlled aggression and passive decline. Enmebaragesi chooses aggression, because in the calculus of ancient power, inaction is indistinguishable from decay. The strategic canvas is now drawn. The objectives are clear: penetrate Elamite territory, inflict sufficient damage to disrupt their capacity for border control, seize material proof of victory that can be displayed in Kish as evidence of divine favor and royal competence. These objectives, simple in articulation, will prove devastatingly complex in execution. The geography itself is the first adversary. Any Sumerian offensive must traverse the Diyala River Corridor, a narrow avenue flanked by mountains and marshlands. This is terrain that nullifies numerical superiority. It is a landscape designed for ambush, for attrition, for the kind of grinding combat that exhausts logistical systems before a single battle is fought. The Diyala River originates in the Zagros highlands and flows southwest into the Tigris. The lower course, where it enters the Mesopotamian plain, is navigable and benign. But the middle course, the section that passes through the transition zone between plain and mountain, is a corridor of tactical nightmares. The valley floor is narrow, often less than 2 kilometers across. The river itself meanders unpredictably, creating marshes on the inside of bends and steep cutbanks on the outside. The flanking hills rise abruptly, offering commanding observation points to any defender willing to occupy them. An army advancing up this corridor is observable from kilometers away. Its movement is constrained by the terrain. It cannot deploy into line formation without sacrificing forward momentum. It cannot split into multiple columns without losing cohesion and inviting defeat in detail. And most critically, it cannot sustain itself without a supply train that is even more vulnerable than the combat units it supports. Enmebaragesi understands these constraints. His advisors, the Council of Elders drawn from the temple hierarchies and the merchant guilds, have made the risks abundantly clear. But they have also made clear the alternative: yield the eastern trade routes to Elamite control, accept the economic and political consequences, watch as Kish's influence within the Sumerian world contracts. This is not an acceptable outcome. The king orders mobilization. The decision ripples outward from the palace compound like a stone thrown into still water. Temple administrators consult their registers of able-bodied men. Village headmen receive orders to assemble work gangs. Artisans in the copper workshops shift production from agricultural tools to weapons. The entire apparatus of the state reorients toward a single objective: the projection of lethal force across 200 kilometers of hostile geography. This is the design of conflict. Not the passionate collision of honor and vengeance, but the cold calculation of economic necessity and political survival. The Sumerian Elamite War begins not with a declaration or a border incident, but with a bureaucratic decision made in a mud brick palace on the edge of the known world. And once that decision is made, the machinery of violence begins its inexorable work. To understand the Sumerian Elamite War is to understand the material culture of violence in the late 4th millennium. This is warfare in its infancy, but it is not primitive. It is prototypical. Every element of military organization that will dominate the next 3,000 years of human conflict exists here in embryonic form. The tension between mass and mobility, the primacy of logistics over tactics, the transformation of agricultural surplus into organized lethality. The armies of Kish are not professional soldiers. They are mobilized laborers, farmers, canal diggers, temple workers, temporarily repurposed as instruments of state coercion. But they are equipped with technologies that represent generations of metallurgical and tactical refinement. The Sumerian arsenal is not improvised. It is standardized. Consider the copper-tipped spear. This weapon, recovered in hundreds of examples from early dynastic contexts across southern Mesopotamia, represents a sophisticated understanding of material science and battlefield requirements. The spearhead is cast using lost wax technique, producing a hollow socket into which the wooden shaft is inserted. The socket allows for field replacement, a critical consideration in an era before industrial supply chains. A broken spearhead can be removed and a new one fitted without discarding the entire weapon. This is maintenance doctrine encoded in the artifact itself. The shaft is typically 2 to 2.5 meters in length, constructed from date palm heartwood or imported cedar. The length is not arbitrary. It represents the optimal compromise between reach and maneuverability in formation combat. A longer shaft provides greater standoff distance but becomes unwieldy in close quarters. A shorter shaft is easier to control but sacrifices the primary advantage of the spear, the ability to engage an enemy before he can close to grappling range. The spear is a thrusting weapon, not a throwing weapon. This distinction is fundamental. A thrown spear is a single-use projectile. A thrusting spear is a tool of sustained combat, capable of repeated strikes as long as the formation holds. The Sumerian infantry fights with spears because they fight in dense ranks, where mutual support and collective momentum matter more than individual heroics. Alongside the spear, the Sumerian warrior carries a shield. Not the ornate ceremonial shields depicted in temple reliefs, but functional battlefield tools. These shields are constructed from woven reeds, layered and laminated with leather or bitumen. The result is a surface that is both light enough to carry over long distances and rigid, enough to deflect projectiles and absorb impact. The shields are rectangular, approximately 1 meter tall and half a meter wide. They are designed to interlock, creating a continuous barrier when the front rank stands shoulder to shoulder. The battle axe represents the penetrative weapon of the era. Where the spear is designed for formation combat, the axe is designed for breaching, both of enemy formations and of fortifications. The bronze axe head, hafted to a wooden handle, delivers concentrated force against a small surface area. It is effective against shields, against the crude body armor of the period, and against the mud brick walls of settlements. Archaeological recovery of battle axes from early dynastic sites reveals consistent design features: a pronounced curve to the blade, a reinforced eye for the haft, and a counterweight on the pole to balance the tool and prevent the handle from splitting under repeated blows. These are not ceremonial objects. They are purpose-built instruments of violence, refined through trial and error on battlefields whose names are lost to history. The sling is the force multiplier of the Sumerian arsenal. This weapon, deceptively simple in construction, represents the most cost-effective means of projecting lethal force at range. A sling consists of a braided cord, typically wool or flax, with a pouch in the center to cradle the projectile. The slinger holds both ends of the cord, places the projectile in the pouch, and rotates the sling overhead to build momentum before releasing one end. The projectile is launched at velocities approaching 50 meters per second. The effective range of a skilled slinger is approximately 200 meters. At closer ranges, under 100 meters, a sling bullet can penetrate flesh and shatter bone. The ammunition is standardized, a detail that speaks volumes about Sumerian military organization. Clay sling bullets recovered from archaeological contexts show uniform dimensions. Ovoid projectiles weighing between 40 and 60 grams. This standardization is not accidental. It indicates centralized production, quality control, and tactical doctrine. A slinger trained with 40-gram projectiles will know instinctively how to adjust his aim and release timing. If ammunition varies wildly in weight and shape, accuracy becomes impossible. The Sumerians produced these bullets in vast quantities. Molds have been recovered that could produce dozens of bullets per day. The clay is fired to increase hardness, then stockpiled in temple armories. When the army mobilizes, each slinger is issued a standard load, perhaps 200 bullets carried in a linen sack. This is ammunition doctrine, as sophisticated as anything that will emerge in the gunpowder age. The formation doctrine of the Sumerian army is built around the principle of concentrated mass. The soldiers fight in rectangular blocks, multiple ranks deep. The front rank carries spears and shields. The second rank also carries spears, their weapons projecting through the gaps in the shield wall. The third and subsequent ranks provide depth, momentum, and reserves. If the front rank suffers casualties, men from behind step forward to fill the gaps. This is not the disciplined phalanx of classical Greece. The Sumerians lack the iron discipline and the bronze panoply that will make the Greek hoplite formation so devastating. But the underlying logic is identical. Aggregate individual soldiers into a collective mass that is greater than the sum of its parts. A lone man with a spear is vulnerable. 1,000 men with spears, standing shoulder to shoulder and moving in coordination, become a nearly irresistible force. The effectiveness of this formation depends entirely on cohesion. If the ranks lose their alignment, if gaps open in the line, if individual soldiers panic and break away, the formation dissolves into a crowd of individuals, and individuals are easy prey. Maintaining cohesion requires leadership, training, and above all, psychological conditioning. The men must believe that their safety lies in the formation, not in flight. Sumerian commanders achieve this conditioning through a combination of ritual, repetition, and ruthless enforcement. Before the campaign, the troops are assembled in the temple precincts. Priests conduct sacrifices and read the omens. The message is clear: the gods favor this expedition. To flee is not merely cowardice, it is sacrilege. During training, such as it is, the men practice moving in formation, responding to shouted commands and to the rhythm of drums. The movements are simple: advance, halt, turn. But simplicity is crucial. In the chaos of battle, complex maneuvers become impossible. Enforcement is provided by the king's household troops, the royal guard. These men are not conscripted farmers. They are retainers whose loyalty is purchased through land grants, status, and access to the spoils of war. They are better equipped, better trained, and they serve a dual function: to provide shock value in battle and to prevent the conscripted troops from routing. This is the Sumerian military machine. The machine is cumbersome, inflexible, and logistically fragile, but it is capable of projecting overwhelming force, provided it can be sustained long enough to reach the battlefield. The Elamite countermeasure is fundamentally different. Elam cannot match Sumerian numbers on open ground. The Elamite warrior is not a formation fighter. He is a skirmisher optimized for rapid movement and independent action. His primary weapon is the composite bow, a technological marvel that will not reach Mesopotamia for another 1,000 years, but which may already be in use in the Iranian highlands. The composite bow, constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, stores and releases energy far more efficiently than a simple self-bow. It is shorter, making it easier to use from horseback or in rough terrain, and it has greater range and penetrative power. Even if the Elamites have not yet developed the composite bow, they certainly employ the sling and the javelin. The javelin is a lighter, shorter spear designed to be thrown rather than thrust. An Elamite skirmisher carries multiple javelins, closing to within 50 meters of the enemy, releasing his weapons, and then withdrawing before the Sumerians can close. This is hit-and-run warfare, designed to inflict casualties without committing to decisive engagement. The Elamite infantry, when forced to stand and fight, employs a looser formation than the Sumerians. They fight in dispersed groups rather than rigid lines, taking advantage of cover and terrain features. Their shields are smaller, lighter, designed for individual rather than collective defense. Their tactics emphasize local superiority, concentrate force at a single point, overwhelm the enemy at that point, then disengage before reinforcements arrive. The Elamites also rely heavily on fortified positions. Early Elamite settlements show evidence of defensive walls, strategically positioned on elevated ground or at the mouths of narrow valleys. These are not cities designed for expansion. They are citadels designed for denial. The walls are not merely physical barriers. They are psychological multipliers. A defender behind a wall is worth 3 attackers in open ground. The Elamites understand this arithmetic intimately. The strategic geography reinforces these advantages. The Zagros Mountains are not a single ridge, but a complex system of parallel ranges separated by high valleys. The passes are few, predictable, and easily defended. An Elamite force holding a mountain pass does not need to match the Sumerian numbers. It merely needs to hold the choke point long enough to exhaust the Sumerian will to continue. The Elamite doctrine, then, is built on asymmetric engagement. Avoid the Sumerian strengths. Exploit the Sumerian weaknesses. Do not offer battle on the plain where mass determines outcomes. Instead, force the Sumerians to fight in terrain that negates their advantages, extend their supply lines, attrit their forces through harassment and ambush. Make the invasion so costly that the political will to sustain it collapses. This is not cowardice. It is operational sophistication. The Elamites are playing a different game than the Sumerians, and they are playing it well. The collision between these two systems, Sumerian mass versus Elamite maneuver, will determine the outcome of the campaign. But before the collision can occur, the Sumerian army must reach Elamite territory. And that requires solving the most fundamental problem of ancient warfare, logistics. Enmebaragesi's offensive requires a supply train of staggering complexity. The army numbers between 8 and 10,000 men, a concentration unprecedented in the historical record to this point. Each man requires approximately 2 kilograms of grain per day. Water consumption in the Mesopotamian summer exceeds 4 liters per man per day. These are not negotiable requirements. They are physiological constraints. The mathematics are brutal. 10,000 men consume 20,000 kilograms of grain per day. Over a 30-day campaign, that is 600,000 kilograms, 600 metric tons of food. This grain must be milled, baked into portable bread or boiled into porridge, packed into sacks, loaded onto transport animals, and move forward at a pace that matches the army's advance. The transport capacity of the era is limited. A donkey, the primary pack animal of the ancient Near East, can carry approximately 60 kilograms. To move 1 day's ration for the army requires 334 donkeys. To move 30 days' rations requires 10,000 donkeys. But those donkeys also require food and water. Each donkey consumes approximately 5 kilograms of fodder and 20 liters of water per day. The logistical pyramid expands exponentially. Enmebaragesi's staff, the temple administrators and merchant advisors who plan the campaign, understand these numbers. They understand that a conventional supply train is impossible. The solution is to accept risk. The army will carry 10 days' rations with it. Supply bases will be established at intervals along the route, stocked in advance by forced labor levies. The final push into Elamite territory will be conducted with minimal baggage, relying on speed and foraging to sustain the force until it can return to friendly territory. This is operational gambling. If the Elamites contest the supply bases, if foraging proves inadequate, if the campaign extends beyond the projected duration, the army will starve. And a starving army is not merely defeated. It is destroyed, dissolved into panicked individuals who abandon their equipment and flee toward safety. Enmebaragesi accepts the risk. Because the alternative, to not campaign at all, is political suicide. The mobilization begins. The army assembles outside the walls of Kish in the early summer of approximately 2700 BC. The precise date is irrelevant. What matters is the season. Summer is chosen because the rivers are low, reducing the danger of flood, but also reducing the availability of water. Summer is chosen because the harvest is complete. freeing labor and providing the grain necessary to sustain the campaign. Summer is chosen because the alternative seasons, spring floods, winter cold, autumn planting, are even less favorable. The assembly itself is a spectacle designed to reinforce royal authority and divine mandate. The troops gather by district, each contingent led by a headman or minor official. The king appears in full regalia, the long skirt of woven wool, the belt studded with bronze ornaments, the crown, a simple band of hammered copper, and the mace, symbol of royal power. Priests perform sacrifices. Animals are slaughtered, their entrails examined for omens. The omens, unsurprisingly, are favorable. The march order is established. The vanguard consists of scouts and light skirmishers, young men drawn from the hunting communities of the marshlands, accustomed to moving quickly over rough terrain. Their role is to provide early warning of enemy contact and to secure water sources along the route. Behind the vanguard comes the main body, 8,000 conscripted infantry organized into rough groupings of 500 men. These groupings are not tactical units in any formal sense. They are administrative conveniences sized to match the grain allocation systems of the temple economy. The household guard, 300 men, marched with the king at the center of the column. These are the professional corps, the shock troops who will be committed at the decisive moment. Behind the main body comes the supply train, 2,000 donkeys, each heavily laden, accompanied by another 1,000 drovers and camp followers. The rear guard consists of another 500 infantry, tasked with preventing desertion and protecting the vulnerable baggage train from harassment. The total force, combat troops, support personnel, and animals, numbers approximately 12,000 souls. This organism, stretched over several kilometers of road, begins its ponderous movement eastward. The first days are almost leisurely. The route follows established paths along the canal network. Villages provide water and supplementary food. The men are fresh, their equipment is intact, and morale is high. They are not yet soldiers, but they are not yet defeated by the psychological weight of sustained campaigning. The column covers approximately 20 kilometers per day. This is slow by any standard, but it is sustainable. The loaded donkeys cannot move faster without risking injury. The conscripted infantry, unused to prolonged marching, need frequent rest stops. The command staff accepts the slow pace because the alternative, pushing the men too hard too early, will result in breakdowns, straggling, and loss of cohesion before the enemy is even contacted. By the fifth day, the army crosses the invisible boundary between Sumerian-controlled territory and the contested frontier. The change is subtle but pervasive. The villages are smaller, more dispersed. The canal systems are less maintained. The population is wary, non-committal when questioned about Elamite movements. This is the borderland where allegiance is fluid and survival depends on not committing too openly to either side. The scouts report no contact. The Elamites are present, watchers on distant ridges, smoke signals indicating the army's progress, but they do not engage. This is itself a form of intelligence. The Elamites are not attempting to stop the invasion at the border. They are ceding ground, drawing the Sumerians deeper into terrain that favors the defender. Enmebaragesi understands the trap, but understanding a trap and avoiding it are different problems. To halt now, to fortify a position on the frontier and declare victory, would be a transparent admission of weakness. The objective is not to occupy borderland. It is to strike deep into Elam itself, to seize spoils, to demonstrate capacity. The only path to that objective is forward. On the 8th day, the army enters the Diyala River Corridor. The geography changes abruptly. The open plain contracts into a valley perhaps 2 kilometers wide. Hills rise on both sides, covered with scrub vegetation and broken by ravines. The river itself meanders unpredictably, forcing the column to cross and recross at shallow fords. The heat is oppressive, radiating from the bare rock slopes and trapping in the valley floor. The first harassment begins on the 9th day. The scouts ahead of the column report movement on the ridges. Before the main body can react, a volley of sling bullets arcs down from the heights. The range is extreme, perhaps 300 meters, and most of the projectiles fall harmlessly. But a few find targets. A man drops, clutching his shoulder where a clay bullet has fractured the bone. Another falls, blood streaming from a split scalp. The conscripts halt, shields raised, scanning the heights, but the Elamite skirmishers are already gone, withdrawn into the ravines and gullies that scar the hillsides. The Sumerian commanders shout orders. A detachment of light infantry is sent to clear the ridge. They climb laboriously, burdened by their equipment and by the altitude. By the time they reach the position from which the slingers attacked, it is empty. The only evidence is a scatter of spare ammunition, clay bullets left behind in the rush to disengage. The detachment returns to the column. The march resumes. But the psychological damage is done. The men now understand that every meter of advance is observed, that the enemy can strike with impunity and vanish before retaliation is possible. The hills, which had seemed merely oppressive, now become malevolent. Every boulder, every scrub thicket could conceal an enemy position. The harassment intensifies over the following days. The attacks follow a consistent pattern. Small groups of Elamite slingers occupy positions overlooking the route of march. Wait until the Sumerian column enters range, release their volleys, and then withdraw before the Sumerians can bring force to bear. The casualties are light, 5 to 10 men per attack, but they accumulate. By the 12th day, the army has lost over 100 men, with twice that number wounded. The wounded slow the column, requiring care and transport that strain the already overburdened supply system. Worse than the casualties is the disruption to the march tempo. Each attack forces a halt while the Sumerians attempt to clear the heights. Each halt consumes time and energy. The column, which had been covering 20 kilometers per day, is now managing barely 12. The projected timeline, reach Elamite heartland in 15 days, conduct raid, return to friendly territory, is already slipping. Water becomes a critical concern. The Diyala River, which should provide ample supply, is increasingly contested. The Elamites have positioned themselves at the best ford sites, forcing the Sumerians to either fight for access or detour to less favorable crossings. On one occasion, the army approaches a ford only to find the Elamites have constructed a crude barricade of logs and rocks, partially damming the river and creating a marsh on the Sumerian side. The obstacles are flimsy, easily dismantled by a work party, but they consume time. And time is logistics. Enmebaragesi faces the fundamental problem of expeditionary warfare. The initiative lies with the defender. The Elamites choose when and where to engage. They can trade space for time, withdrawing indefinitely as long as the Sumerian supply situation deteriorates. The Sumerians, meanwhile, are locked into a forward trajectory. To halt is to fail, to retreat is to admit defeat. The only option is forward into an operational environment that becomes more hostile with each passing day. On the 14th day, the king makes a decision that will prove consequential. A strong Elamite position has been identified occupying a ridge that overlooks a critical section of the route. The position cannot be easily bypassed. The terrain funnels the column directly beneath the Elamite slingers. The alternative is a detour of several kilometers through marshland, a route that will consume 2 days and exhaust the men. Enmebaragesi orders a direct assault. 300 men, drawn from the more reliable conscript units, are tasked with storming the ridge. The operation begins at dawn, time to use the low sun to blind the defenders. The assault force moves in dispersed groups, using whatever cover the terrain provides, attempting to close the distance before the Elamites can inflict crippling casualties. The Elamites see them coming, of course they do. The element of surprise is impossible in terrain that offers commanding observation. The slingers begin their work methodically, targeting the lead elements. Men fall, tumbling down the slope or collapsing among the rocks. The assault force presses on, driven by the knowledge that to retreat now is to have suffered for nothing. At 100 meters, the Elamite slingers shift from massed volleys to aimed individual shots. This is the killing range, where accuracy meets lethality. The Sumerian assault fragments into individual rushes. Small groups of men sprint forward, throw themselves behind cover, then resume the advance. It is exhausting, terrifying work. Some Sumerians reach the Elamite position. Hand-to-hand combat erupts among the rocks. Spears thrust, axes swing, men grapple and fall. The fighting is brief and savage. The Elamites, outnumbered at the point of contact, do not attempt to hold. They withdraw further up the slope, regroup, and prepare for another engagement. The Sumerian assault force, bloodied and disorganized, does not pursue. They have achieved the tactical objective. The ridge is cleared, but the cost is staggering. Of the 300 men committed, 70 are dead or dying. Another 50 are wounded seriously enough to be unable to continue. The effective force has been reduced by 40% in an action that lasted less than an hour. The main column passes beneath the now unoccupied ridge and continues its advance. The wounded are loaded onto pack animals, displacing supplies. The bodies of the dead are left where they fell. There is no time, no capacity for burial. The crows and jackals will have to suffice. That evening, the army makes camp in a wadi that offers some protection from observation. The men are exhausted, hungry, the grain ration has been reduced to conserve supplies, and profoundly demoralized. They have been marching for 2 weeks, they have lost over 200 men, and they have yet to see a single Elamite settlement, let alone achieve the objective of seizing spoils and demonstrating Sumerian power. The household guard moves through the camp, enforcing discipline, preventing desertions. But the guard cannot prevent the whispered conversations, the calculations each man makes about his odds of survival. The army is not defeated, but it is corroding. Enmebaragesi's commanders counsel withdrawal. The supply situation is critical. Grain reserves are below 50%. The men are exhausted. The operational timeline is broken. To continue deeper into Elamite territory is to court disaster. But the king refuses. To withdraw without achieving any tangible objective is political catastrophe. The rival cities of Sumer will see only failure. The gods will be interpreted as having withdrawn their favor. Enmebaragesi's authority, perhaps his very throne, depends on success. Defined however minimally, there must be success. He orders the advance to continue, but the objective shifts. No longer is the army driving toward the Elamite heartland. Instead, it is seeking any target of opportunity, a settlement, a supply depot, a temple, that can be raided and looted to provide the weapons of Elam that the king must carry back to Kish on the 16th day. The scouts report contact. A fortified settlement, perhaps 3 kilometers ahead, situated on a defensible hilltop overlooking the valley. The Elamites are offering battle, finally. The settlement that the Sumerian scouts have identified is not a major city. It is a frontier fortress, one of a network of defensive positions that the Elamites have established to control the approaches to the highland plateau. The position is formidable. The fortress sits atop a hill that rises perhaps 80 meters above the valley floor. The slopes are steep, rocky, and largely devoid of cover. A mud brick wall, crude but serviceable, encircles the summit. Inside the walls, perhaps 1,000 non-combatants, farmers, artisans, families who have taken refuge from the advancing Sumerian army. More importantly, the fortress is defended by approximately 1,500 Elamite warriors. This is not a skirmishing force designed for harassment. This is a concentration intended to fight a set-piece battle. The Elamites have decided to make a stand. Enmebaragesi understands immediately that this is his opportunity. If he can storm the fortress, he will achieve multiple objectives, eliminate a significant enemy force, seize a tangible prize to display as spoils, and demonstrate Sumerian capability to project power. If he fails, the campaign collapses. There is no middle ground. The king orders a reconnaissance in force. Light infantry probe the approaches, attempting to identify weak points in the defense and assess the enemy's disposition. The reconnaissance is met with volleys of projectiles from the walls. The Elamites are well supplied with sling ammunition and javelins. The Sumerian probes are driven back with casualties. The terrain offers no obvious avenue of approach. The hill is steep on all sides, and the Elamites have cleared the slopes of vegetation that might provide cover to attackers. The only approach that is not suicidally exposed is a shallow ravine that angles up the eastern slope. The ravine provides defilade dead space not easily observable from the walls, but it is also the obvious route. The Elamites have certainly prepared defenses there. Enmebaragesi's plan is straightforward because complexity is impossible given the constraints. The main assault will be directed up the eastern ravine, attempting to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. Simultaneously, diversionary attacks will be launched against the northern and southern slopes to prevent the Elamites from concentrating their full force against the main assault. The household guard will be held in reserve, committed only when a breach is achieved or when the assault falters and must be reinforced. The assault is scheduled for dawn for the same reason most ancient assaults occur at dawn. The low light degrades the defenders' ability to target attackers, and the psychological advantage of beginning the day with offensive action favors the attacker. The night before the assault, the Sumerian camp is a steady and controlled tension. The men know what is coming. Many of them will not survive tomorrow. They sharpen their spear points, check their shield bindings, and make whatever peace they can with their gods. The officers move among the ranks, delivering speeches that blend exhortation, threat, and promises of plunder. The message is consistent. Victory brings wealth and honor. Cowardice brings death. The household guard prepares more methodically. These men have done this before, not at this scale, but they have fought in the small wars and raids that characterize Sumerian interstate relations. They understand the mechanics of assault. Stay close to the man in front of you. Keep your shield up. Do not stop moving forward. Once momentum is lost, it cannot be regained. Enmebaragesi does not sleep. He stands at the edge of the camp, staring up at the fortress. Fires burn along the walls. The Elamites are not sleeping either. They know the assault is coming. The only question is whether they have the will and the resources to withstand it. Dawn comes with the slow inevitability of all dawns. The sky lightens from black to gray. The Sumerian army stirs, men rising from their sleeping mats, donning their equipment, forming into their assigned groups. There is no trumpet call, no dramatic signal. The assault begins when the lead elements simply start moving toward the fortress. The diversionary attacks go in first. 500 men advance against the northern slope, shields raised, moving in a loose formation that can adapt to the broken ground. They are not expected to breach the walls. Their role is to draw Elamite attention and resources away from the main assault. They advance to within 100 meters of the walls before the Elamites respond. Slingers and javelin throwers line the ramparts, releasing volley after volley into the advancing Sumerians. The casualties are immediate and heavy. Men fall, struck by projectiles they never saw coming. The advance slows, stops, becomes a static firefight as the Sumerians attempt to suppress the defenders with their own slingers. This is exactly what Enmebaragesi needs. The Elamites are committed, engaged, focused on the northern approach. The southern diversionary attack follows the same pattern. Another 500 men, another grinding attritional exchange. The Elamites split their forces, reinforcing both threatened sectors. And then the main assault begins. 2,000 men, the largest single concentration of force the Sumerian army can muster, pour into the eastern ravine. The front ranks carry shields and spears. The rear ranks carry axes and siege ladders, crude constructions of lashed wood that will be needed to scale the walls. The column is dense, compressed by the narrow confines of the ravine, men pressed shoulder to shoulder in a mass that is both their strength and their vulnerability. The Elamites have prepared the ravine. Boulders have been positioned at choke points, ready to be rolled down onto the attackers. Concealed pits, shallow excavations covered with brush and designed to break ankles and disrupt formations dot the approach. And at the head of the ravine, where it opens onto the flatter ground just below the walls, the Elamites have constructed a crude barricade of timber and stone. The Sumerian assault hits the first obstacles within minutes. Boulders crash down from the slopes, smashing into the column, crushing men and creating panic. The advance slows as soldiers attempt to navigate around the dead and wounded as officers scream orders that are barely audible over the din. Some men step into the concealed pits, falling and bringing down those behind them. The formation compresses further, becomes a mass of Badas struggling to maintain forward momentum. The Elamite defenders at the barricade wait until the Sumerians are within 30 meters. Then they unleash a coordinated volley of projectiles. Javelins, sling bullets, even rocks simply thrown by hand, everything that can be hurled is hurled. The front ranks of the Sumerian assault stagger under the impact. Shields splinter, men drop. but the mass behind them continues to push forward, driven by momentum and the impossibility of retreat. The Sumerians reach the barricade. Axes rise and fall, hacking at the timber framework. Spears thrust through gaps, seeking Elamite defenders. The Elamites respond with their own spears, stabbing downward at the attackers. This is fighting at its most primal. No maneuver, no tactics, just strength against strength, will against will. The barricade holds for perhaps 10 minutes. Then a section collapses under the sustained assault. Sumerian infantry pour through the gap, scrambling over the wreckage, engaging the Elamite defenders in hand-to-hand combat. This is the moment of crisis. If the Sumerians can exploit the breach and reach the walls, the fortress may fall. If the Elamites can contain the breach and restore the barricade, the assault will stall. The fighting at the breach is apocalyptic. Men fight with spears until the spears break, then with axes and daggers, then with bare hands. The wounded are trampled by those still standing. Blood turns the ground into mud. The noise, screaming, the clatter of weapons, the thuds of impact is overwhelming. The Elamites commit their reserves. Warriors who had been positioned along the walls descend to reinforce the barricade. The weight of numbers begins to tell against the Sumerians. For every Elamite who falls, 2 Sumerians fall. The breach, which had seemed on the verge of widening, stabilizes. Enmebaragesi, observing from the valley floor, sees the assault faltering. He commits the household guard. 300 men, the best equipped and most experienced warriors in the Sumerian army, advance into the ravine. Their arrival provides the necessary impetus. The household guard does not merely fight. They impose organization on the chaotic melee. They form a wedge, concentrate force at a single point, and drive through the Elamite line. The barricade is overrun. The Elamites fall back toward the walls, fighting a rearguard action that is skillful and disciplined. They are not rooting. They are conducting a tactical withdrawal to a stronger defensive position. The Sumerians pursue, but the pursuit is sluggish. The men are exhausted, disorganized, and acutely aware of the Elamite defenders still lining the walls above them. The assault reaches the base of the mud brick wall. This is where siege ladders are supposed to be deployed, where the attackers are supposed to scale the defenses and carry the position. But the ladders are inadequate. They are too short, too flimsy, constructed by men who had no experience in siege warfare. Because siege warfare barely exists as a concept in 2700 BCE, the ladders are propped against the wall. Men begin to climb. The Elamites methodically push the ladders away from the wall. The climbers fall, some landing awkwardly and breaking bones, others landing on their comrades below. A few ladders hold long enough for Sumerians to reach the ramparts, where they are immediately engaged by multiple defenders. These men fight alone, unsupported, and they are quickly killed or thrown from the walls. The assault has reached its culmination point. The Sumerians have committed all available forces. They have suffered staggering casualties, and they have not achieved a breach. The walls still stand. The Elamite defenders, though bloodied, are intact and continue to inflict casualties on the Sumerians huddled below. Enmebaragesi faces the decision that every commander dreads: continue the assault and accept annihilation, or withdraw and accept failure. He chooses withdrawal. Officers are sent forward with orders to disengage. The household guard, still relatively cohesive, covers the retreat. The conscript infantry, disorganized and panicked, stream back down the ravine in a chaotic mass. The Elamites do not pursue. They remain on the walls, hurling projectiles at the retreating Sumerians, but not risking a sortie that might negate their defensive advantage. They have won. Not by destroying the Sumerian army, but by denying it victory. And in the mathematics of siege warfare, denial is sufficient. The Sumerian army withdraws to the valley floor and consolidates. The casualties are catastrophic. Of the 2,000 men committed to the main assault, over 600 are dead. Another 400 are wounded seriously enough to be non-effective. The diversionary attacks suffered lighter casualties, but still lost 200 men between them. In a single morning, Enmebaragesi has lost over a quarter of his combat-effective force. The king's commanders again counsel withdrawal. The objective is impossible. The supply situation is now critical. Grain reserves are sufficient for perhaps 5 days at reduced rations. The men are demoralized, exhausted, and increasingly prone to desertion despite the best efforts of the household guard. To remain is to invite catastrophe. But Enmebaragesi is trapped by the logic of his own gamble. He cannot return to Kish without spoils. The political cost of failure is too high. He must find an alternative target, something that can be raided and looted to salvage some measure of success from this disaster. The scouts are sent out again, and by midday they report an Elamite supply caravan, perhaps 10 kilometers to the north, moving along a parallel valley. The caravan is guarded, but lightly. Perhaps 200 warriors accompanying a train of pack animals laden with goods, copper ingots, timber, grain, and weapons destined for the frontier fortresses. This is the target? Not a glorious victory over a fortified position, but a raid on a supply train. It is anticlimactic, almost pathetic measured against the original ambitions of the campaign. But it is achievable, and achievement, however modest, is necessary. Enmebaragesi detaches a flying column, 1,000 men unencumbered by baggage, tasked with intercepting the caravan. The column moves rapidly, covering the distance in a forced march that leaves the men gasping but arrives at the caravan's projected route by nightfall. The ambush is set in a narrow section of the valley where the caravan must pass. The Sumerians position themselves on both sides of the route, waiting in silence. The Elamite caravan arrives at dawn, the guards weary and complacent, not expecting contact this far from the front line. The Sumerians attack from both flanks simultaneously. The Elamite guards, outnumbered 5 to 1 and caught completely by surprise, are overrun in minutes. Some fight and die. Others flee, abandoning the caravan. The pack animals, panicked by the noise and violence, scatter. Sumerian infantry pursue them, recovering what they can. The haul is significant. Several tons of copper and tin ingots, bundles of finished weapons, spears, axes, and daggers, sacks of grain, and luxury goods including woven textiles and small quantities of lapis lazuli. It is enough. It is proof. It is the weapons of Elam that the Sumerian King List will record. The flying column returns to the main army, laden with spoils. Enmebaragesi orders immediate withdrawal. The campaign is over. The army turns west, retracing the route it has carved through the Diyala Corridor, and begins the long march home. The Sumerian army returns to Kish in late summer. The city's population turns out to witness the triumphal entry. The king, riding at the head of the column, is dressed in full regalia. The household guard, still relatively intact, marched in formation. Behind them come carts piled with the captured spoils, ingots, weapons, textiles. The display is carefully choreographed to emphasize success and minimize the visible evidence of failure. The conscript infantry, what remains of them, trail behind. They are gaunt, exhausted, and in many cases wounded. But they are alive, and they are home. For them, survival is victory enough. They will return to their fields, their canal work, their ordinary lives. The war will become a story they tell, its horrors softened by distance and selective memory. The official account, as recorded by the temple scribes, is unambiguous. Enmebaragesi, who carried away the weapons of Islam, this is what will be preserved in the Sumerian King List, what will be transmitted to future generations. The phrase is accurate as far as it goes. The weapons were indeed carried away, but the phrase conceals as much as it reveals. The true cost of the campaign can be reconstructed, if imperfectly, through archaeological and comparative analysis. Of the 10,000 men who marched east, approximately 6,000 returned. 4,000 did not. Of those 4,000, perhaps half died in combat, killed in skirmishes, in the failed assault on the fortress, in the ambush and harassment that characterized the entire campaign. The other half died from disease, exhaustion, exposure, and accidents. These deaths are no less real for being unheroic. The wounded present a separate category. Perhaps 2,000 men returned bearing injuries that would prove permanently debilitating, broken bones that healed poorly, leaving men lame, infected wounds that would fester and kill weeks or months after the campaign ended. Psychological trauma, what later eras will call shell shock or post-traumatic stress, that renders men incapable of functioning in civilian life. The economic cost is equally staggering. The grain consumed by the army represents the surplus of thousands of hectares of agricultural land. The copper and bronze committed to weapons production represents years of mining and smelting labor. The opportunity cost, the productive work not done because labor was diverted to military purposes, is impossible to quantify but certainly substantial, and what was gained. The immediate material gain is the captured spoils. The copper ingots are valuable, immediately useful for civilian production. The finished weapons augment Kish's armory. The luxury goods, while symbolically important, have minimal economic impact. In purely material terms, the campaign is likely a net loss. The strategic gain is equally ambiguous. Elam has not been conquered, nor has its capacity to contest the eastern trade routes been significantly degraded. The frontier fortresses remain intact. The Elamite military, though it suffered casualties in the caravan ambush, remains a coherent force. Within a year, perhaps less, the situation will return to the pre-war status quo. The political gain is what matters to Enmebaragesi. He has demonstrated the capacity to mobilize and sustain a large-scale military operation. He has projected power across hostile geography. He has returned with tangible proof of success. These achievements enhance his prestige within the Sumerian interstate system. Rivals are reminded that Kish possesses both the resources and the will to wage war. Allies are reassured that Kish remains a credible power. But there is a darker political consequence that will only become apparent over time. The campaign has revealed the structural limitations of Sumerian military power. The army, for all its size, proved incapable of achieving a decisive operational success. The logistical systems, though sophisticated by the standards of the era, proved inadequate for sustained campaigning in hostile territory. The tactical doctrine, built around massed infantry formations, proved vulnerable to asymmetric tactics and difficult terrain. These lessons are not lost on observers. The rival cities of Sumer, Uruk, Ur-Lagash are watching and calculating. They see that Kish, despite its wealth and its ambition, can be resisted. They see that the cost of projecting power is high, perhaps prohibitively so. They see opportunity. Within 2 generations, Kish will be eclipsed by Uruk. The shift in power will be driven by multiple factors, but among them is the perception that Kish's military adventurism has exhausted its resources without achieving commensurate gains. The Sumerian Elamite War, which was intended to secure Kish's hegemonic position, will instead mark the beginning of its decline. The Elamites, for their part, draw their own lessons. They have demonstrated that a smaller, less wealthy power can successfully resist Sumerian aggression through defensive strategy and asymmetric tactics. The model they establish, fortified positions, harassment of supply lines, avoidance of decisive battle, will be employed by mountain peoples against lowland empires for the next 3 millennia. The operational lessons of the campaign are profound, though they will not be systematically analyzed or codified for many centuries. The Sumerian Elamite War demonstrates several fundamental principles that will recur throughout military history. First, the primacy of logistics. The campaign was not decided by the quality of troops or the skill of commanders, but by the brutal mathematics of supply. The Sumerian army could project power only as far as its logistical tether would allow. Once that tether stretched to its limit, operational freedom collapsed. They needed only to make the cost of invasion unsustainable. By exploiting terrain, by contesting every meter of advance, by forcing the Sumerians to expend resources without offering a decisive engagement, they achieved a strategic victory despite tactical setbacks. Third, the danger of political objectives that exceed military means. Enmebaragesi's campaign was driven by political necessity, the need to demonstrate power, to secure prestige, to preempt rival claims. But the political objectives required military capabilities that the Sumerian army did not possess. The gap between ambition and capacity created a strategic trap from which there was no clean exit. Fourth, the psychological dimension of sustained combat. The Sumerian conscripts were not professional soldiers. They were farmers and laborers, temporarily mobilized and minimally trained. The Elamites recognized this and designed their strategy accordingly, not to destroy the Sumerian army in a single blow, but to erode its cohesion gradually until psychological collapse became inevitable. These lessons will be relearned countless times. The Sumerian Elamite War is not unique in demonstrating these principles, but it is the first time they are demonstrated in a context that is documented, that leaves archaeological and textual evidence that can be studied and analyzed by future generations. But each of those deaths was an individual tragedy, a farmer who will never return to his fields, a son who will never again see his mother, a husband whose widow must now navigate survival alone. The ripple effects extend outward, families impoverished, villages depopulated, agricultural production disrupted. The wounded carry their trauma home. Some adapt, finding ways to contribute despite their injuries. Others become burdens on families that can ill afford to support non-productive members. And some simply disappear from the historical record, lost in the vast anonymity of ancient poverty. The collective memory of the campaign is shaped by those in power. The official narrative, inscribed in temple records and recited in royal propaganda, emphasizes victory and divine favor. The unofficial narrative, transmitted orally among the survivors, likely tells a different story of suffering and waste, of leaders who gambled with lives that were not their own, of objectives that were never worth the cost. Both narratives are true, and both are incomplete. The Sumerian Elamite War, like all wars, is too complex, too multifaceted to be captured in a single narrative. It is simultaneously a demonstration of human organizational capacity and human folly, of courage and waste, of ambition and limitation. What endures is the record. The cuneiform tablets that document the campaign, however incompletely. The archaeological evidence of fortifications, of weapons, of mass graves. The patterns of political change in the decades that follow. These are the raw materials from which later generations will attempt to reconstruct what happened and what it meant. And what it meant, ultimately, is that war had become not merely a fact of human existence, but an institution. An organized, documented, rationalized activity that engaged the full apparatus of the state. The Sumerian Elamite War is not the first human conflict, but it is the first war in the recognizably modern sense. Planned, resourced, executed, and recorded. It is the first war that future commanders can study, that future states can emulate or learn from. It is the first canvas of conflict. And every war since is, in some sense, a response to the patterns it established. The Mesopotamian sun rises over the alluvial plain, as it has risen for 6,000 years of human civilization and will rise for 6,000 more. The cities of Sumer, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash continue their intricate dance of alliance and conflict, trade and war, rise and decline. The patterns established in 2700 BCE will repeat with endless variation but underlying consistency. Within 50 years of Enmebaragesi's campaign, Kish's dominance will fade. The city will remain important, wealthy, even, but it will no longer set the terms of Sumerian politics. That role will pass to Uruk, whose kings, including the semi-legendary Gilgamesh, will pursue their own campaigns of expansion and glorification. And Uruk too will eventually decline, yielding to Ur, to Lagash, to Akkad. The wheel turns. The Elamites endure. Their civilization, rooted in the Iranian highlands, will persist for nearly 3,000 years. They will fight countless wars against Mesopotamian powers, against the Akkadians, against the Babylonians, against the Assyrians. They will win some and lose others, but they will maintain their independence and their distinctive culture far longer than any individual Sumerian city-state. The Diyala Corridor remains a strategic avenue. Armies will march through it for millennia: Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Parthian, Sasanian, Arab, Mongol. The geography does not change. The tactical constraints remain constant. Commanders in the 20th century CE, planning operations in the same region, will face identical problems to those that confronted Enmebaragesi: how to sustain and advance through restrictive terrain, how to secure supply lines against harassment, how to achieve objectives before logistical collapse. The weapons evolve. Copper gives way to bronze, bronze to iron, iron to steel. The spear is joined by the sword, the bow, the crossbow, the musket, the rifle, the machine gun. The principles of violence become more efficient, more lethal, but the underlying logic remains recognizable. Concentration of force, economy of effort, maintenance of the objective. These concepts, which exist in embryonic form in 2700 BCE, will be refined and systematized, but not fundamentally altered. Military history emerges as a discipline. Commanders study past campaigns to extract lessons applicable to present challenges. The Sumerian Elamite War, though ancient and obscure, is part of this literature. It is data points in the eternal project of understanding organized violence. Modern archaeology has given us access to the material culture of the early dynastic period. We can hold in our hands the same type of copper spearhead that a Sumerian infantryman carried up the Diyala Corridor. We can walk the same ground, though the cities are now mounds of eroded brick, and the rivers have shifted their courses. This physical evidence grounds the written record. The Sumerian King List is not mythology, it is history. Enmebaragesi was a real king who ruled a real city and waged a real war. The specifics may be lost or distorted, but the essential fact remains. Human beings, 47 centuries ago, were already engaged in the organized, systematic prosecution of political objectives through military force. War is structural. War emerges wherever human societies reach sufficient complexity to support specialized military institutions. And once war emerges, it becomes self-perpetuating. Each conflict creates grievances that fuel the next. Each demonstration of military power invites emulation or counter-mobilization. The system feeds itself. But the implications are also illuminating. If war is ancient, then so is the human capacity to analyze war, to plan war, to seek alternatives to war. Enmebaragesi and his contemporaries were not mindless barbarians. They were sophisticated thinkers grappling with complex strategic problems. They made mistakes, certainly. They pursued objectives that were not worth the cost. But they were attempting to navigate the same fundamental tensions that confront every political leader: security versus resources, ambition versus capacity, short-term gains versus long-term sustainability. The Sumerian Elamite War offers no easy lessons, no simple formulas. What it offers is context. It reminds us that the challenges we face, how to project power, how to deter aggression, how to manage conflict, are not new. They are as old as civilization itself. The technologies change, the scale expands, but the underlying problems remain hauntingly familiar. Consider the logistical challenge. Enmebaragesi needed to move 10,000 men and their supplies across 200 kilometers of hostile terrain. Modern militaries need to move divisions across continents, oceans, even into space. The scale is incomparable. But the fundamental problem, matching consumption to supply, maintaining tempo without overextending, is identical. The ancient quartermaster calculating donkey loads and grain rations is solving the same problem as the modern logistics officer calculating fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure. Consider the tactical challenge. The Sumerian infantry, advancing in dense formation, were optimized for one type of combat and vulnerable to another. Modern militaries design forces for specific missions, accepting vulnerabilities in exchange for capabilities. The tension between specialization and flexibility, between preparing for the expected threat and adapting to the unexpected, is eternal. Consider the strategic challenge. Enmebaragesi needed a victory, not for its own sake, but to maintain political credibility. Modern leaders wage wars for similar reasons: to demonstrate resolve, to reassure allies, to deter rivals. The gap between political objectives and military outcomes, the danger of committing to campaigns that cannot be won at acceptable cost, these are not modern phenomena. They are intrinsic to the nature of war itself. And consider the human challenge. The Sumerian conscripts who marched east were not volunteers. They were coerced, dragooned into service by a state that offered them little choice. Their morale, their cohesion, their willingness to fight depended on factors largely beyond the control of their commanders: the legitimacy of the cause, the competence of the leadership, the perception that the sacrifice would be worth it. The Sumerian Elamite War is a mirror. When we look at it, we see ourselves. It is the beginning of a conversation about power, violence, and human possibility. A conversation that spans nearly 5 millennia and remains unresolved. Enmebaragesi spoke the first word. We are still formulating our response. The sun sets over Mesopotamia. The ruins of Kish are silent, the bones of its warriors long since returned to dust. But the questions they raised, the patterns they established, the costs they paid, these remain, waiting for each generation to confront them anew. This is War Atelier. The first canvas of conflict, analyzed and dissected across 47 centuries. The techniques were crude. The palette was limited. But the ambition to transcend mere survival, to pursue objectives through organized force, to document and remember and learn, that ambition was fully formed, and it endures. You're watching War Atelier. Subscribe for uncompromising war history.